The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
I will let David lead us in prayer, but I just want to remind you that this is our last session. And on behalf of all of the pastors, Mary Ann and Beth and Dione and Mark and myself, we want to thank you for your participation in our program this year. Remember last week I did ask you to provide us feedback, so please just write it out and give it to any one of the pastors or chaplain that are here. And if you have any topics that you would like to see us bring to you next year, I think like Dr. Schramm indicated he might want to come back if we all were interested in that, so please let us know. If there were any speakers that particularly touched you or enthused you, let us know. If there are any speakers who particularly disenthused you, let us know that too.
That night where all the pastors were up front, let's not do that again, Patrick.
You know, I will tell you that I got the best feedback on that night. I really did. People, it came up to me afterwards, or even when I come here on Saturday nights, and said that they really thought that was a great evening and got to know us better. So I know, Mark, you have that past that you keep trying to hide.
keep trying to bury it. It keeps coming back.
One of these days it's going to come out in full color. In fact, it might win an Oscar when they make the movie of it.
Science fictions don't win Oscars.
12 Years a Sinner, I think they might call it,
yeah.
Right?
30 years a sinner.
You're not that young, Mark. But please give us feedback and speakers, suggestions, and ideas, because we'll start in May again, beginning to kind of brainstorm and plan this for next year. So anytime that you want to do that, and feel free to talk to any one of the pastors about your thoughts or suggestions or ideas. So we'll turn it over to David.
Great, thank you. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
You have a sheet? Everybody have a sheet? So on one side you have a song, and on the other side you have some reflection questions. So we're going to start with the song. How many are familiar with this song? Either by every ill. Anybody? A couple. Okay. So I'll sing the refrain through. If you know it, you can certainly start in, and then I can sing the verses, and then I'll just invite you to sing the refrain because it's a little bit easier. Healer of our every ill, light of each tomorrow, give us peace beyond our fear, and hope beyond our sorrow. Let's sing that together. Healer of our every ill, light of each tomorrow, give us peace beyond our fear, and hope beyond our sorrow. You who know our fears and sadness, grace us with your peace and gladness. Spirit of all comfort, fill our hearts. Healer of our every ill, light of each tomorrow, give us peace
Give us strength to love each other, every sister, every brother. Spirit of all kindness, be our guide. Healer of our every ill, light of each tomorrow, give us peace beyond our fear, and hope beyond our sorrow. You who know each thought and feeling, teach us all your way of healing. Spirit of compassion, fill each heart. Healer of our every ill, light of each tomorrow, give us peace beyond our fear, and hope beyond our sorrow. Let us pray. O God, you have called your servants to ventures of which we cannot see the ending, by paths yet untrodden, through perils unknown. Give us faith to go out with good courage, not knowing where we go, but only that your hand is leading us and your love supporting us, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. So this is our third and last session in the area of less common melodies in the spiritual life. And as I've said the past couple of times I've been here, my observation is, and you don't have to agree with me, and maybe your personal experience in your church or in your personal history may be slightly different, but my observation is that we often don't talk too much about the spiritual life in particular. That we talk about the gospel and we talk about church tradition, but oftentimes we don't think about the dynamics of the spiritual life. In part, I think there's probably a lot of reasons for that. One of the reasons may be that it's particularly, it's an invitation to a kind of vulnerability that many of us would prefer to ignore, even as pastors, because there's no way to talk about the spiritual life without, in some ways, doing some self-implication about talking about one's own spiritual journey, or at least some of the dimensions to it. And as much as it is a little bit difficult and vulnerable, requires vulnerability, I also think there's a lot of power in it. It's really an important part of being a Christian. It's an important part of being a pastor. It's an important part of giving testimony to others. So my thought was to pick some themes that may not be as popularly talked about, or at least to talk about maybe a topic that's talked about a little bit, but put a slightly different framework around it. So we talked a lot about self-denial in this first session, try to kind of reframe that a little bit. And then in the second session, we talked about, now it just went right out of my head, so sorry about that. We talked about acedia, and I talked a little bit about what happens when we have a visit from the noonday demons, as the psalmist says. In other words, when we get tempted by the possibility of being distracted from the spiritual path. And I talked a little bit last week about how it's easy for us to think of the fact that we've been tempted as a bad sign, that somehow it's an indication that there's something wrong with us, when in truth, to experience temptation is usually an indication that we're on the right path, that we're actually making some progress And this, the powers that be, the principalities, the powers and principalities, as the New Testament would call them, want to distract us from that work. And so what does that mean, and how do we live in response to that? Tonight we're going to talk a little bit about fear, which is a topic that I think also we don't talk a lot about unless it comes up particularly in Scripture. And one of the things I'll start with by saying is, for this topic as well as for the other topics, and really in general conversations about the spiritual life, one of the things I think is fascinating and helpful is that we allow ourselves to let our own experience of the spiritual life come into conversation with the resources of our religious faith. We have a lot of wise and rich resources in our tradition, and sometimes we access them and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we might be likely to pick up something in the bookstore or read an article of something that's in the newspaper, but we're not very likely sometimes to look back in history. So sometimes I'll have seminarians will say, I don't know why I have to study church history. First of all, it's boring, and second of all, why it's not going to make me a good pastor. What I need to be studying is studying about grief and studying about pastoral care, and they can list all the things they think they should be studying. And my normal response, I say lots of things, but one of the things I say in response, other than go off to history class and be quiet, is that if you're a Christian and you've ever struggled to live the Christian life, and if you've ever made a mistake in living the Christian life, whether you call it a sin or whether you call it a mistake or whether you miss the mark, wouldn't it be helpful to know that you could go back and talk to people, at least through texts, who have also experienced what it means to not succeed at living the spiritual life and find out how they dealt with it? Wouldn't that be helpful to you? But yes, it'd be good to connect with people who have actually had this experience. I said, well, that's what church history is. It's about consulting our ancestors and finding out what they did in their struggles in the spiritual life. Sometimes they had different struggles than we did. Sometimes they had very similar ones. Sometimes the historical contexts were vastly different than our own, but the challenges were quite similar. And in some cases, the challenges were quite different. But we have a lot at our disposal if we would just access them. And I would also add, as we'll see tonight, it's not just the Christian tradition, but there also are resources available to us from other spiritual traditions that also could be very helpful to us. I just realized I didn't turn my phone off, so I'm going to do that right now, sorry. And I think fear is a good place for that to show up, where there are other religious traditions might be helpful. Fear is something that's talked about in all of the spiritual traditions. So Christianity is not the only one that addresses this challenge. So I imagine how many of you were in service this Sunday and heard the gospel. I think the Transfiguration is the story that we heard. Everybody remember the story from the Gospel of Matthew? And when the disciples get freaked out in the second part of the story, what does Jesus tell them? Do not afraid. Do not be afraid. We've heard this before from Jesus, right?
A lot.
Yeah, a lot. Jesus says this a lot. And why does he say it a lot? Well, he says it a lot because the disciples are full of fear. And the religious leaders of the day, at least many of them, not all of them, but many of the religious leaders of the day were also full of fear. And so he was often telling them, do not be afraid, do not be afraid, do not be afraid. I have been thinking about this in preparation for tonight, and I'm wondering if you were really afraid in a moment of fear, and somebody said to you, do not be afraid, and you're shaking your head. You're already going probably where my head's going. How would you respond to that? Maybe it's happened to you. It makes you angry. Why?
Fear is an often very appropriate, always very normal human response, and you're telling me to take away my humanity, and I can't do that.
Yeah.
And that's a frustrating,
So when people say that, they're asking you, you said they're taking away your humanity because fear is a natural response. Okay, anybody else? Anybody else have that sort of response sometimes? I won't tell anybody, I promise. Don't be afraid, I'm not gonna.
If you told me not to be afraid, I would be afraid because that meant there was something to be afraid of.
Oh, okay, so if I told you not to be afraid, then you would think there really is something,
Then I'd be
okay?
afraid.
Reverse psychology, yes. Yeah, I was thinking about this. If a seminarian said that they were doing a verbatim in their pastoral care class, talking to a parishioner, and they said, I told them, don't be afraid, that's probably what I would say, is a flag would go up to me and say, this is not really good pastoral care practice. I'm sure you've probably encountered this opportunity where you might want to say that, don't be afraid. But the challenge is that it can, and I'll say it's not always this way, but it can feel dismissive. It has the power, the potential anyway, to say, whatever it is that you're experiencing or feeling isn't valid, so you should just ignore that. So I don't know whether there's more to the story that the gospel writers don't tell us, or whether Jesus just wasn't very good at pastoral care, or as my husband said, I'm not interested in defending Jesus, so don't make me do that. So, but I also think there's another way to look at it, at least from the gospel perspective, that it doesn't have to be seen as patronizing or dismissive, although it could sound like that. It's possible that when somebody says that to us, somebody who is close to us and who loves us, and we know that they love us, that they mean it not exactly in the way that the phrase sounds, not so much don't be afraid as in, but things will be okay. That's what my partner and I say to each other when we get anxious. But what we mean by that, for us, that's a kind of code language. In some ways, you can't promise that things will be okay, because sometimes they're not okay. But by saying that, what we're trying to say to each other is, whatever happens, I'll be there. That whatever it is you have to face, even in your fear, you won't be alone. And I think that's kind of what Jesus is trying to tell the disciples. That's what I'd like to think. I don't know whether maybe Jesus really was bad at pastoral care. I don't know. But I'm thinking that maybe what Jesus meant to say is, whatever you go through and whatever fears you have, you can be assured that I will not leave you alone. And in some ways, even when I'm gone here physically, I will still be here with you in some way. You'll still have access to me. That you can trust me about that piece. So that's kind of how I try to contextualize what the gospel is trying to say. Again, you don't have to buy that. You can have your own interpretation of that. One of the things that I think about is that sometimes people will say that because they really do want to dismiss what we're feeling. They really do want to be patronizing because if I want to expand it out, sometimes they want to say, your concern is really quite small and you're worried about something that's actually nothing. Or there are basically people in our lives, and I'm sure we've all encountered it, where we're feeling anxious about something or feeling afraid, and they don't want us to feel afraid. And it usually, oftentimes, is because they don't want to feel afraid and they don't know what to do about it. So this is often the case with family members, is that we don't want our loved ones to be afraid, but we also know that sometimes there's nothing we can do about what it is that they're going through. And so we tell them, don't be afraid, because we don't want to be afraid, because we don't know what to do, right? So we try to pass it on, and it often doesn't work. The opposite is also the case, and I've talked a little bit about this earlier in the first session, but it's important to note, is that we live in a culture and a society that wants us to be afraid. There are countless powers in this country that want us and really expect us and rely upon us to be afraid. Every time there's a storm, the potential weather, they love, to some extent, it's interesting to sort of watch them modulate their language and their tone. This season I've been kind of watching the weather people, and there's been some moments where when they've gotten a bad call, and then the next time they realize they've got to be careful about how they speak. But there's a certain sense of we have a duty to make sure that people are on alert, but sometimes it turns into we want people to really be afraid. Sometimes I listen to the news, both local and national, and the way in which they report what's going on in the world is they report it in a way that escalates fear rather than lowers it. Sometimes, unless we read more widely and investigate what we're told on the news, we may be led to believe certain things are happening in other countries when all what we're seeing is a very small view of what's happening. A good example of that is what happens in Israel-Palestine. We get a very, very small view of what's happening in that part of the world. And anybody who goes there for a visit and comes back will tell you that we get a very, very small perspective. And that mostly what we get is designed to escalate our fears. Oftentimes it's designed to escalate our fears both religiously as well as politically, so that we should do something or else something will happen to us. Right? And again, the politicians do this in countless ways, is that they will, not all politicians, and I'm not against politicians, I'm not saying they're all bad, but I do know that politicians can manipulate information to encourage us to be fearful and therefore take actions that we normally wouldn't support. And one of the ways they do that is by giving us very limited information and then putting it in the worst possible light. So you and I actually have these very odd forces in us as being Christians who live in the United States, is that we have a gospel and a Savior who tells us regularly not to be afraid, and we live in a culture and in a climate in which every night on the news and every day in the newspaper, somebody is trying to tell us, be afraid. Your borders aren't strong enough. You don't have enough money to retire. You don't have enough money for next week. Your future may be liable, may be vulnerable because these politicians are going to take away your X, Y, and Z. I mean, you name it. You've heard it. So I know you know this. This is nothing new. So it's particularly troubling if you're trying to not be afraid and you're living in the context that we're living. It's really quite hard. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to reframe the conversation, so similar to what I've been trying to do each week. Instead of talking about do not be afraid, because I don't really find that a helpful strategy. Anytime anybody's told me that, I can't do anything with it. I want to think about it this way, and that is training to be fearless, or becoming fearless, which has a very different connotation to it. And first of all, what it means is that if we want to become people who are fearless, I'll talk about the good part of fear, so I'm not going to dismiss fear altogether. But the good part about this is that we realize that we actually have to practice being in a relationship to fear in healthy ways. Because fear actually, as I'll show in a moment, is actually a very good thing. At least that's the way the Christian philosophical tradition tells the story. And I think you probably would agree on some level. But it also says that our goal ultimately is not to act out of fear. There's a difference to register fear and to register danger. There's another thing to act, especially thoughtlessly, out of that place. And I'm sure that all of you have experienced that in your life one way or another. Either you've encountered somebody who is driven by fear, or maybe in your own life you've had moments where you've looked back and said, you know what, I wasn't thinking clearly, I was driven by fear. I was afraid of this and this and this. And because of that, I did these things. And if I had just taken a moment to catch my breath and to think about this more clearly, I wouldn't have acted this way. I wouldn't have done these things. Are you following me? Are we kind of going? Okay. If you're not following me, you disagree, you have a question, just flag, raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. So I've been doing a lot of, I think I'm determined to make all of Columbia Greek philosophers, because every time I come here I talk about Greek philosophy. I mean, I do teach it, so that's probably why I talk about it. But I find it very powerful, even if I choose to disagree with the tradition. But I've been telling you this story about the chain of being, which I'm going to draw up here again. So you recognize this from a long time ago if you were here. So this is the place where you and I come from. Up above this line is the immaterial world, the spirit world that Plato would talk about. And below that line is the material world. That's where you and I have our existence. So one of the things that happens is that you and I start up here in this immaterial world, this spiritual world, and we start with a soul. We start with something that's generated. We eventually will convert Plato's chain of being into at least these powers, into the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And we say that our existence comes from there. And so our soul is born out of the life of God. And that triangle there is the soul, and then the box below it is the body. That's my little code language for who we are. So you and I, we say in our Christian heritage that we're composed of as a body and soul. This is our basic philosophy of humanity, as it were. That doesn't surprise anybody, right? No, right? Pastors, you're on board with this? I mean, you can disagree later. If you become postmodernist on me, then you'll have to let me know. So one of the things that Plato talks about is this soul, this triangle. The reason I draw it as a triangle is because Plato says it has three parts, or three, he calls it parts tripart, I call it three powers. I think is a better language to use in the English and communicates better. And you might recognize these parts. So part one is I gave you two of them, desiring and spirited. The first one, desiring, this is a power of the soul that takes us into community. This is the power that draws us into relationship with one another. So when we desire, it draws us closer to things, right? So I desire to be in relationship with people. I desire to be fed. So this is what draws us outward, into connection, into community. It's a very important power of the soul. The other power, the spirited power, is the power that actually protects us. It's just the opposite. If the desiring power is going forward, the spirited power is withdrawing. It's the part that says, wait, stop, don't take me over. This is me, that's you. Don't step on my turf, right? It's the power that keeps us, in some ways, safe, a kind of safe distance around ourselves. Helps provide distinction. Now, what do you notice about these two powers as I describe them? These are the two powers of our souls. There's a third power, but what do you notice if this is the case?
Emotions? Their emotions?
There are powers. I would be careful about, they might lead to emotions, or be connected to emotions. And they have a commonality with emotions, which I'll say something about in a minute.
You're opposite.
They're opposites. This is the biggie, yeah. Plato talks about them as two horses. And if you had two horses, that were like this, they would be going like that, right? So our soul is pulled in two different directions. Part of us wants to go back to our room and be by ourselves, and the other one wants to be in the common room talking with people and having a good time, right? The problem is that they're both part of us. And maybe we've experienced that in our life. We like, which way do I go? I don't know, you know. And the thing about them is that why they're somewhat connected to emotions is they're immediate, right? So these powers, their benefit is that they're able to do something in the current moment. So in other words, if I want to eat ice cream and I'm desiring ice cream, I'm desiring it right now. Like I'm hungry for it right now. I'm not thinking about the fact that I might be hungry for it tomorrow. Right? It's an immediate need. I don't think, oh, I'm so hungry I want ice cream tomorrow. No, I want it right now. If somebody is about to hit me, you know, I want to be defensive at this moment. I don't want that to appear to me tomorrow. I say, oh, I should have went like this. Right? It's got to be immediate. And that's the beauty of these powers. Now, and I have to always remind ourselves, these are important. These are, we would say God-given. Plato wouldn't have said God-given, but they come to us from the good, from that which is perfect. These powers are not bad things. They are both very good, we would say holy. They are part of who we are, part of what we receive directly from God. The problem is that they just kind of want to go their own way. So they need a charioteer, Plato says. So the soul is a chariot with two horses, desiring and spirited, taking two different directions, and so they need something to drive the chariot. It shouldn't come as any shock to you. The driver of the soul is reason. Reason is that which gives modification to this third power gives modification to the other two powers of the soul. And one of the reasons that reason is the head of the soul is that reason has the ability to do something that the other two powers can't. And that is it can see into the future. At least not like predict the future, although it's kind of like that. It's that it can take a current activity, an immediate moment and need and response, and project it, the ramifications into the future, right? So if my desiring part says, I want ice cream and I want it now, and I sit down and eat a half gallon of ice cream, right? I'm going to get sick, amongst other things. And if I did it on a regular basis, I would not only get sick, but I would get big, right? That's what reason tells us. Reason says, wait a second, if you keep eating like this, this is what's going to happen to you. Or if you eat this entire half gallon of ice cream right now, you're going to get sick and throw up. Right? Reason, the desiring part can't do that. It's all it's thinking about is it wants it and it wants it now. But reason says, wait, think about this. Project this into the future. Or think about the last time you did it. And then project it into the future. That's what it's going to look like again. That's why reason is so powerful. So, where do we put fear in this equation? Which power of the soul does fear belong? It's in one of these three powers. It's in the spirited part, yeah. Because this is the place, the spirited part covers the same territory. In other words, it says, this is a potential threat to you, pay attention, be ready to do something should something happen. And reason modifies that. Reason says, wait a second, it looks like it could be a threat, but it might not be, so hold on. You know, I think about that recent episode in the news in Florida. You know, the man that's been come to trial, about the man who shot those young men, right? This is, I mean, in my estimation, I'll just a little footnote here, this is a man who actually didn't pay attention to his fears. His spirited part of his soul took over, and he wasn't able, this is the best case scenario interpretation, he wasn't able to not act out of fear. Because there wasn't any, like he could have said, maybe there's a potential here because I'm in this altercation, but he wasn't looking at all the data that was coming to him. There was no reason for him to to make the kind of to take the kind of action that he took. But that's exactly what happens when fear takes over and reason isn't part of the equation. They all have to be operating at full force. So, if this is true, if Plato is right, and the Christian tradition which takes this teaching up and baptizes it in Christian tradition, if this is true, then when we feel afraid, it's our soul trying to tell us something. To put it in very blunt language, is that when we're feeling anxious or anxiety or afraid, whatever language we use, it's our soul trying to get our attention. It's a good thing. What's not always good is what we do with it. That's the challenge. That's the key. Because what can happen is that fear can do one of two things. In the long run, it can do one of two things. It can either harden us, or it can either soften us. These are really the main two options. To live in fear and to act in fear again and again and again will harden us to the point where that span that I was talking about between being afraid and acting will become so short that we'll do crazy things like lashing out at people. Like, in other words, the trigger becomes so quick, we don't even need to see all of the various pieces. We start with a very presenting issue, and then all of a sudden, we're responding negatively. That's hardness of heart, ultimately. It seems to me the challenge is that if we don't give in to, like we think about the fact that people want us to be more afraid than we need to be, people who don't want us to be afraid, then the other option is, and this is where the church doesn't always do well, is that we want to displace people's fears, and we just say, okay, Jesus will take care of that, right? Or God will take care of that. Well, again, I don't find that particularly helpful, to be honest, myself. Because when I do that, or when I'm taught to do that, or told to do that, or invited to do that, I miss out what my soul is trying to teach me. Displacing it, denying it, obliterating it, none of those things really are helpful. Because then we don't find out what it is that's going on inside of us in terms of this fear. So what could our fears teach us? Well, there's a lot of things they could teach us. One of the things they might be able to teach us is they could teach us what's important to us, right? Because if you, again, think about it the way Plato talked about it, when we get afraid, it means we're protecting something. There's something at risk for us. And so the question is, what is it that we're trying to protect? And this is often where I think we're not very self-aware. We can be quick to anger and quick to be afraid, but very slow to think, okay, what is it that I'm trying to protect? Why am I going off on this? Right? Has anybody had that problem? I mean, I have. Having a knee-jerk response. Somebody says something, I fire. I say something, I do something, and then I think, what's going on here? Why am I so defensive? What's happening here? Right? Many of us don't even know what's compelling us. So when I say what's important to us, I'm thinking about what compels us in this life. What is it that drives us? What is it that, you could say what gets us up in the morning, but that may not always be the case. But it could be a desire to be loved. It could be a desire to be special. It could be a desire to be at peace. A desire to be in control. A desire to be right. Some people just love to be right. They have to be right. So if somebody threatens that, down they come, right? A desire to be safe, right? In other words, there's an indication that somehow I'm going to be harmed in some way or another. A desire to be helpful. Some of us are compelled by being like a desire to be helpful, right? And so sometimes our fear is that if I can't be helpful, then I'm going to be useless. Actually, this is a fairly common problem in church life because so many of us who are in church life want to be helpful to the church and helpful to the community and helpful to the pastor and helpful to our neighbor, but sometimes that can go too far. Even being helpful can be too far. We're compelled by that to do it even when it's not reasonable to do so. We could be compelled by a desire to be successful. So in other words, my fear kicks in when I'm afraid that I'm not going to look or appear to be successful. And so as soon as something happens that would jeopardize my public persona or the way people see me, I'm going to lash out. I'm going to act out of that fear. Another thing that our fears can tell us probably tell us something about our past. In other words, we don't come to our fears just willy-nilly. Most of us come to our fears. You train to be fearless, but you also train to be afraid. Right? So many of the things that you and I, if we were to make a list of the things that frighten us, or things that we're afraid of, I would bet to a person, most of the things that we would write down have come to us from our families. Something that our mother or our grandmother or our father or grandfather or older sibling told us. Right? It could be something very innocent, or it could be something that's terribly not so innocent. Something that was devastating. I remember my mother often saying, as she recollected on her childhood, how many times she was told her father died when she was 13, and her mother was sickly really for the majority of her life. But one of the things that her elder brothers and sisters would say is that if you keep misbehaving, your mother is going to die and we're going to send you to the orphanage. Right? That was the line of reasoning that my mother got as a young child. Right? So you can imagine the kind of anxiety to be good that created in her. I mean, it made her the best church lady there ever was. But part of it is driven by this: if I don't do this, the consequences will be severe. That I'll be put in jeopardy. And so, again, I don't know whether it was intended to be malicious or not, but the end result was really not a very good thing. So I think they were just trying to get my mother to behave, to be simple about it. But we all have things like that, things that we grew up in. The way in which we relate to money, the way we relate to relationships, the way we relate to even our faith. So many of us were told certain things about behaving a certain way in order to please God, or that God would do certain things to us if we didn't behave, or if we didn't do what our parents said. Right? And so if that kind of thought pattern or recording that we have going on in us isn't checked and checked out and examined, some of us could still be working out of that same old tape. That if I don't do this, God's going to be mad at me. And when that happens, I want you to think, okay, where's my reason at in the power of my soul? Let the reason kick in and say, wait a second, God is not going to necessarily be mad at me because of this. I have to think this through. I have to think about what's the context for that. And maybe it was something that we needed to be doing when we were 20, but maybe not necessarily at 50 or at 70 or at 80. Very different kinds of conversations. But see, all of that would be lost if we just dismissed our fears. If we just said, I'm not supposed to be afraid. First of all, probably we would continue to be afraid, and we just wouldn't examine it. But all that stuff that we're able to learn about ourselves would be lost. We wouldn't really get to know about who we are and what makes us tick, and why do we obsess about the things that we obsess about. read you two very short paragraphs, two very different examples. And they're pretty startling, to be honest. One is, and this is taken from a book called The Places That Scare You. So this is a story told by a Buddhist teacher. The story is not particularly Buddhist, but the application fits with us. This is a great little book. I give this to leaders. I think they should read this book. A friend was telling me about her parents in Florida. They live in an area where there's poverty and hardship. The threat of violence seems very real. Their way of relating to this is to live in a walled community protected by guard dogs and electric gates. It is their hope, of course, that nothing scary will happen or enter. Unfortunately, my friends are becoming more and more afraid to go outside those walls. They want to go to the beach or the golf course, but they're too scared to budge. Even though they now pay someone to do their shopping, the feeling of insecurity is getting stronger. Lately, they've become paranoid even about those who are allowed through the gates. The people who fix the broken appliances, the gardeners, the plumbers, and the electricians. Through their isolation, they are becoming unable to cope with an unpredictable world. These are people who aren't training to be fearless. Right? And we're surrounded, we live in a world where these kind of communities are common. Right? Where we do everything we can to protect ourselves and isolate ourselves from our neighbor. So that we don't even know who our neighbor is, or we don't have any contact with our neighbor, or allow somebody to come into our life who's not escorted in some appropriate way. This is antithetical to the Christian life because it doesn't really teach us at all about what it means to be fearless. And actually, it does just the opposite. It encourages fear again and again and again. This is practicing to become fearful, not practicing to become fearless. You following what I'm saying? It's easy to get to this place because I think so many of us, we don't do it all in one big... If somebody were to describe it to us in this way, we might be a little bit taken aback. And you might even find this description kind of harsh. But what happens is we find ourselves in these places, any of us could find ourselves, not just in that kind of location, but behind walls, never going out of our house, never talking to anybody, never answering the door, never speaking to a stranger, because we're afraid that somebody might do something to us or hurt us. We do that by small incremental ways. We don't do it in huge ways. Right? We usually get to it gradually, to the point that we find out, oh my goodness, I've completely isolated myself from everybody. And then we wonder why we're lonely. We've completely walled everybody away because I don't want to get hurt. Right? Let me read you just the opposite. Another story, very short. A young woman wrote to me about finding herself in a small town in the Middle East, surrounded by people jeering, yelling, and threatening to throw stones at her and her friends because they were Americans. Of course, she was terrified, and what happened to her is interesting. Suddenly, she identified with every person throughout history who had been scorned and hated. She understood what it was like to be despised for any reason: ethnic group, racial background, sexual preference, gender. Something cracked wide open, and she stood in the shoes of millions of oppressed people and saw with a new perspective. She even understood her shared humanity with those who hated her. This sense of deep connection, of belonging to the same family, is the way of peace. We could say is the way of fearlessness. The woman who found herself right in the middle, where you would expect her to be afraid, and it was frightening, no doubt. She probably didn't say, oh, this isn't frightening. She probably crapped her pants. That's what I would have done, right? But what matters is how she responded to it. In other words, did she lash out at people, or did she allow that experience to soften her into a place of compassion, to realize, oh my goodness, first of all, I'm not the first person to have ever been persecuted. To kind of allow herself to realize, oh my goodness, this is what it's like to be completely the scorn of somebody. Whether it's justified or not, it's not the point. Right? The point is to be able to kind of feel that, and then instead of making that hardening her heart toward the people who were actually the potential to do her wrong, actually soften her to become compassionate, not only toward them, but also to herself. That's training to become fearless.
It's theology of the cross. It's vulnerability.
That's right.
Strength and vulnerability. Strength and weakness.
Right. And you don't do this like overnight, right? Even Jesus didn't do it overnight. I mean, if you track the stories to Jerusalem, Jesus had lots of close encounters of very painful, that could have ended his life early on. But he built a kind of resiliency, is the word I like to use, to say, wow. I mean, so ultimately when he gets to the cross, he can say, these people don't know what they're doing. Like, they are acting out of their deepest fear, and they have no idea. But I would say that even Jesus took some time to get to that. Like, he had to kind of come to that realization that he didn't have to lash out in fear.
He was just as fearful of himself.
Yeah,
He wanted that cross removed.
Yeah.
Get us out of here. I don't want any part of it.
right, yeah.
That's the fully human.
That's right, the fully human Christ. Yeah. So we don't become fearless without training, without practice. If we're a person that's afraid, and a person who, and I've met a lot of people I've met a lot of Christians who really live with a lot of fear, of all kinds of fear. But if we want to move beyond that, we're going to have to train ourselves to practice fearlessness. And it's not by not being afraid, it's about trying to find out what our fear has to teach us. What is exactly that I'm afraid of? What is it that I think is going to happen to me? Do I feel like I'm going to ultimately be alone as I face this? And that's a spiritual question. And we have to not romanticize the answer. I mean, sometimes we say, well, I believe that God is with me, and that's nice, but sometimes we also need human companionship. Right? It's not just about having God present to us, but it's actually about having other human beings present to us, and allowing other human beings to be present with us. I often think about my grandmother, as she got toward the end of her life. She lived to be 99, but when she was living alone up until her mid-90s, somehow she would both be afraid of being alone, but didn't also want anybody to be around her. And what I couldn't help her see, I mean, she would allow us to be around her immediate family, but she didn't. She was surrounded by neighbors who actually liked her and cared for her and were after her well-being, but somehow she couldn't allow them in to be present to her. So when they would come to visit, she would complain to me and say, oh, the lady so-and-so, I forget her name now, down the street, Sally or whatever it was, she came here and she wouldn't leave. I couldn't get rid of her. You know? I said, well, Grandma, you know, it's like, it's good that you're not alone, that you know you have friends and they care about it. They come, they bring her food, they bring her fresh oranges, they bring her tomatoes. All she can do is complain about the fact that they've come to visit her. And then she'll call my dad and say, I'm lonely, there's nobody around. It's like, okay, you can't have it both ways. You gotta, you know. But the truth of the matter is that she was just like the rest of us. I mean, my grandmother wasn't any different than I am. It was just easier for me to spot her dynamics than to see my own. But the truth of the matter is that we're all capable of that. I can see myself in doing that. You know, I lock myself up in my room or in my office and push myself into my work, and then I wonder why I don't have any friends. Right? It's like, well, it's something natural. If that's all you do is work, then that's what's going to happen. If you don't make time to be in relationship and have friends, then you're not going to have any. That's, you know. Say something. Okay.
Although I think your grandmother and my mother are the same person.
It's an easy place to get to. So, another way to put it is, if we wanted to train to be fearless, it seems to me that we have to refrain from running away or running from uncertainty. And when I say that, I mean running from uncertainty even into day-to-day existence. Uncertainty about, you know, maybe uncertain. Sometimes the things that can be even uncertain in terms of whether, you know, the food that we're going to eat is going to be to our liking, or uncertain about whether somebody's going to be able to come visit us or not, or uncertain about how our family relationships are going to turn out. If you're like me, there's an awful lot of anxiety and fear that come around family gatherings, right? And I have to kind of prepare myself. And I can either do that one of two ways. I can have a nice stiff drink before I go, or I can have a little talk to myself and say, why are you so worried about the uncertainty of this event?
Should we ask what you do most often?
I actually do a little bit of both. It depends on if it's family, I tend not to drink. Although I did try it the last time, and it worked really well. Just one drink. It was just one, that's all. Just one gin and soda, and everything was smooth. So I don't advocate that as a way to... But the point is that we all have uncertainty in our life, and we have to kind of identify where it is, what it has to teach us, and how am I going to respond? And how am I going to allow it to soften me and become more compassionate, or am I going to allow it to harden me and to build walls? In other words, so I'm going to build walls and protect myself. The best way not to get hurt is just not to talk to anybody or not to be in a relationship. If I just do that, then I'll never get hurt again, right? It's the age-old practice. So it has become to sort of, as we move closer to the end of these sessions, the two popular conversations around the spiritual life are usually gratitude and discernment, because they're often considered to be the foundations of the Christian spiritual life. In other words, you can't have a deep Christian spiritual life without gratitude and discernment. And when I say gratitude, I'm saying, what I mean is not feeling grateful, but being grateful, which is a difference, right? There's a difference between feeling grateful and being grateful, acting grateful, right? Sometimes we don't feel grateful, but that doesn't make any difference. We still have to act grateful. We still have to be grateful. Discernment, though, is a matter of the ability to distinguish one thing from another. So discernment comes from the word to cut in Latin, discernere, which means to separate out. So it's a practice of being able to distinguish one thing from another, one idea from another, distinguishing one path from another. If we say somebody has a discerning eye, right? It means that they're able to distinguish good from bad. Say they have a distinguishing eye for art. That means they can distinguish between good art and bad art. Somebody says he has a discerning palate, right? That means he knows one wine from another, or he knows one cheese from another, or one bread from another. They can taste it. They can distinguish, right?
That can be opinion.
Pardon?
I said that can be opinion.
It could, well, yeah, the good or bad part can be opinion, but distinguishing one from another is not opinion. There is certainly a difference between Chèvre and Gouda, and somebody with a distinguishing palate could, now whether they're good or not, that's another matter. But the thing about this is the bedrock of Christian spirituality, because this allows us to distinguish one path from another. It ultimately is supposed to help us distinguish the way of the Spirit versus the way not of the Spirit. That's why it's considered to be the foundation. It's not necessarily acting, but it's being able to notice the difference. And one of the reasons that it's the foundation is that a life of discernment, or to be a person of discernment, ultimately leads to freedom. It's the path to freedom. Because when you're able to see the distinct options, then you have a better chance of picking the right one. And most of us tend to act quickly without using our reason, driven by either our spirited or desiring parts, and then all of a sudden we're halfway there and say, how did I get here? How did I get into this relationship? How did I eat the second half gallon of ice cream? How did I take this trip and spend all this money and didn't think anything about it? I mean, there's all kinds of things we get ourselves into, and we realize, I didn't think at all. I didn't think this through at all. I wasn't able to distinguish, why am I doing this? What's driving me? What's compelling me? So when we're driven by what compels us, then we're not free. When we're free, we make choices. It may not be the right choice. I'm not saying that every time we act out of freedom, we make the right choice. But at least we make a choice. So people who are spiritually mature make choices and take responsibility for them. But the only way you're able to do that is if you're a person of discernment. You can't do that. And if you're a person who's not afraid, who lives out of fear. If you live out of fear, then you're blinded by being compelled by whatever it is that's driving you. You can have the fear, but you can choose to behave differently. And you might even choose to behave differently over the course of time. There are some people in our life who we should be afraid of, right? Not everybody is good for us. And the truth of the matter is that sometimes that changes over time too. Somebody who is not good for us at the age of 15, that might not be the case when we're 50. It would actually be unhealthy to say, it was dangerous for me to be around them when I'm 15, and to completely say they must be the same, right? That's not fair either. So even our understanding of people can change over time. But you have to practice that, not just kick it in, not just rely on this immediate instinct. So if you take your sheet, we've got a few minutes. I've got 3 reflection questions, and usually I do these as take-homes. But the downside of that is I don't get to hear your voice very much, and you don't get to hear each other. So I want to ask you to think about question 1. We'll start here. What could it look like when I am afraid that I don't have the right understanding of God, or the right understanding of Jesus, or the right understanding of whatever it is, some other matter of faith? Maybe it's the teaching on communion, or maybe it's I don't have the right understanding of the gospel. You plug in whatever it is. What might that look like in your context to be afraid? You don't have to say yours. You don't have to. This is not confessional time. You can posit this, what it might look like. Maybe you've seen it in somebody. Might make you what?
Lutheran.
Might make you Lutheran. Say more.
Well, I mean, really, I used to be Mormon.
Okay.
But that was really one of the things that I started to question, was their theology of God and faith and grace and just a whole host of things. And in questioning and wondering and fearing, I came to a place, theologically speaking, where I was told several times was quite Lutheran, in that it's really about grace, so I don't have to be afraid. So, in a very real sense for me, fear kind of propelled me into a different place along the faith journey.
So, if I had to summarize this, you had a fear in your Mormon context. You had a fear about whether what you were thinking was correct, and the way you chose to deal with that is to kind of push yourself more deeply into the questions, and by looking at them, discover from feedback from others that you sounded like you were Lutheran, just to move you into the Lutheran. So that's one way of dealing with it. Can you think of an alternative of that, what it might look like if you didn't do that?
Oh, I think the opposite would have been, I would have just been, I think, first, for all intents and purposes, faithless, running away from him completely.
So not knowing whether it's right or not, and
I
just,
felt like, I mean, I just jumped into it, into the questions, or run away from him and turn my back.
okay, so you could have run away. No. I was thinking of a third option too, but can you think of it? The third option would be, in other words, denying the questions and being defensive about it. In other words, whatever it was that you were taught as a Mormon, and say, nope, this is it. I'm not going to allow myself to question any of this, because if I open up that box, it's like Pandora's box. I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to shut it down. I'm going to stay, but I'm not going to entertain any conversation or talk to anybody about their opinions about God, because I don't want to stir up a hornet's nest. I mean, a lot of people like that, really, who are really afraid if they open up this conversation about God, it's just going to lead to a disastrous end. So.
David, I'm working with someone now who appears to have a very unnatural fear of death, that every minor ailment puts them into a tailspin of, I'm going to die, I'm being punished, I must have done something wrong, God has punished me with these illnesses, and I'm going to die.
Right.
And this has been going on for a number of years now, when at no point has she ever had a illness that might have naturally led to that, like a heart attack or
Right.
a cancer. They've all been broken bones or, pneumonia, mild case of pneumonia, things like that. And I'm trying to get her, she is scared to death of dying.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, she doesn't like to sleep at night because she's afraid she's going to die.
Mm.
And I'm thinking that, and I was talking to her the other day, that, you have such great faith. I mean, she takes part in faith activities and things like that, and appears to be spiritual, praise, and there just seems to be a disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
And I found myself saying the other day, don't be afraid. So I figured if it was good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me. But it's hard to get through that defensiveness, that fear of what I would think is maybe an unnatural, at least for me, an unnatural fear of death over almost any minor thing.
Oh.
So that's an example of what I've seen just in the last few days with someone.
Okay. I'm not on how I can sum that up exactly, but otherwise, what could it look like when I'm afraid that I don't have the right understanding of God or Jesus?
Either drive you closer or farther away
From
from God.
God. Say a little more about that.
Well, if you're afraid, if you're afraid and you don't dig into it, you're going to get farther away, I think. But if you're afraid and you want to really understand, you dig into it and start trying to find out what's going on, it actually draws you closer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's two choices I see here.
No. Yeah, and I think, to Beth's point, I think the three options that she laid out are really pretty common. I mean, people either will build up a wall and not talk about it at all and not entertain anything else, or they'll run away completely, or they'll dive in and dig into the questions and try to find people who will have a conversation with them about that.
Don't you think it turns into some hatred too? I think of these whack jobs that hold the signs up in protest. Don't tell me there's not, that God, acts like this. I don't believe that kind of. They're fearful of difference or a challenge to the faith. I know, was it 2 years ago, we had a Muslim imam do a presentation. The emails were hateful from the ministerium. They were downright hateful because of fear of that's not God.
Right.
Yeah, we know that, but, it's part of us though,
Mhm.
whether we like it or not.
Right, right.
It's in our DNA, and I think that kind of fear just breeds ignorance, it breeds hatred, because they don't want anything that's going to be different
Yeah.
than them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do think that for us, particularly as Christians, I can't speak for other traditions, but for Christians, particularly Western Christians, we want our religion to be riskless.
Right.
We want us to be able to practice a faith that is conclusive, and therefore we can decide who's in and who's out, rather than to say, to live a life of faith is to cast my lot with Christ, not knowing the answer until the end of time.
And the more that think like we do, the better off we are.
Yeah, that's right. Well, because, every person who doesn't believe like that threatens.
Right. That's
Me,
That's what I meant.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's so common today. It's kind of continually strange to me how we as Christians actually do that to each other. One of the biggest problems within Christianity is that we refuse to admit that there are multiple ways to be Christian. We don't read the Bible the same way. We don't practice Christianity the same way. There is no such thing as Christianity, like one solid thing. There are multiple Christianities. There are multiple Jesuses, or as Lee Barrett at the Seminary likes to say, Jesus. The plural of Jesus is Jesus. Because there's lots of different Jesuses. And if you read the Gospels, you know this. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they're all very different types of Jesus. And so when we get crossed with that, we don't know what to do with it. We get destabilized.
I think of our life if we were all a C note, how boring we would be.
That's right. Yeah.
But the harmony comes in when there's a different note there.
Yeah, great metaphor. I've heard some people use the jazz band as a great
Yeah,
metaphor
absolutely.
too. James Cone.
The dissonance adds something.
Pardon?
And the dissonance adds-
That's right. That's right. Dissonant notes add something to it. I encourage you to look at questions number 2. We're at our time, but questions number 2 and 3. What could it look like when I'm afraid that I will grow older alone? For those of us who don't have children, sometimes we think about that. I tell my partner, just having children doesn't mean you're not going to grow old alone, so don't count on that. That's not equated together. But it can drive us to do crazy things when we let this kind of fear compel us. What could it look like when I'm afraid that the people or projects, that is work, home, family, won't succeed or be safe under my guidance, care, or leadership? So many parents live under this burden. What happens if I live under the fear that my children won't live to live the kind of lives that I think are respectable or successful, or whatever it is that we hope they'll lead, whatever kind of lives we hope they will lead? What does it look like to live, what could it look like to be aware of that kind of fear? No parent can go on without having that. Every parent worries about what's going to happen to their children and what they're going to grow up to be. And that doesn't stop when they turn 50. My mother's still worried about me. What, latest thing I'm going to get involved in, and, but the truth of the matter is that she has to figure out for herself what's at stake in her fear. She has to figure out what it is that's going on there. Is she afraid that somehow she's going to be judged by God for my actions? And I remind her regularly, I say, you're not responsible for what I do. Yeah, she said, well, that's true, I'm not. She said, I don't take responsibility when you do good things, and I'm not going to take responsibility when you do things I disapprove of. Is that good? That's,
You can't shelter your kids from everything.
that's right. You can't shelter them. That's right. You can't control how they're going to respond to those conditions. Again, you can train them to be resilient, which I think is really important. You have to train your kids to...
You have to learn to fail.
That's right. Exactly. How to fail well and how to take it, right? Which I think has become somewhat of a lost art in our
No, I was
culture.
really good at that.
Yeah, we all know, we've heard
Yeah.
stories.
It's very successful.
Very successful at failing. So sometimes though, when we don't allow our children that kind of space, and we don't take responsibility and investigate what that fear is about, then we can make the lives of our children miserable, right? Or even our spouses. You know, we have certain expectations of our spouses, and they're not able to live up to that, and so we make their life miserable because we're afraid about something that we've projected on to them. And again, I would keep going back to this. The goal here isn't to chastise ourselves for being afraid. This is a natural part. We're kind of built this way. So the question is, why am I afraid, and where is it coming from? What can I do about it? That's the key. And the healthy spiritual life isn't not to be afraid. The healthy spiritual life is to allow our fears to teach us about who we are and about how we live in this world and how we might live. And that, I think it's time to conclude. And thank you for the time together. These 3 sessions have been great. I've appreciated being with you.
David, if you would lead us in prayer to end our session.
God of all times and places, God of every season of our lives, we give you thanks for our life. We give you thanks for our life together in community. We thank you for the ways in which you draw us in our spiritual lives closer to one another and closer to you. We pray that you would bless us, bless our lives of gratitude and discernment. Bless us in our times of fear and desire. Bless our times of reasoning and reflection. Help us to pay attention to our lives and pay attention to one another so that we might learn from one another and learn from our own life the life to which you have called us. In this upcoming season of Lent, help us to weigh our priorities carefully so that we might celebrate the Paschal mystery and the resurrection with you and the Christ and the Holy Spirit and all your people. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Again, thank you for participating this year. Please give your feedback to any one of the pastors. And on behalf of all of the pastors this evening, I wish you all a holy and blessed season of Lent. Thank you. Have a great evening and stay home.